Good evening, all, and welcome to this webinar presentation of Sisters-in-Law, Getting to Know Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor. My name is Alan Frosch. I am the co-owner and chief community officer at Tattered Cover Bookstore here in Denver, Colorado. It is a pleasure to welcome you this evening. A couple quick housekeeping notes as people populate on the call. It is probably best if you view this presentation in speaker mode, as we'll have some great conversation among our four panelists, and we'll highlight the speaker at that time. We are thrilled to have the author of Sisters-in-Law, and again, I have the book right here, so I will send links for anyone who wants to purchase the book. Again, there will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. If you'd like, you can use the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send questions to the moderators. Scott and I will be moderating that question and answer. But at this moment, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce my partner in this webinar series, Diane Gilboa, who is the producing artistic director at Theater Or, also here in Denver, Colorado. Diane.
Alan, thank you so much, and good evening to everyone. Theater Or is the Hebrew word for light, so we're Theater of Light. We are a small nonprofit theater organization. We don't have a subscription base. We focus on 1 or 2 plays a year, and we've been focusing on Sisters-in-Law for the past 2 years, postponed twice because of the pandemic. We're now crossing our fingers that we are opening September 25th. And before I have Alan introduce our guest moderator, I just want to take a moment to thank our many sponsors. This is a true community event, and we hope the community will also turn out for the play. Our sponsors: Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck, LLP, Tierney Lawrence, LLC, the Fireside Theater, University Lending Corporation, Boulder Jewish Community Center, Mizell Arts and Culture Center at the J, Gibson, Dunn and Crothers, LLP, and I must give a shout out to Jessica Brown and Gregory Kerwin of Gibson Dunn, who were instrumental in helping us assemble the panelists for this incredible series. Gibson Dunn, remember that law firm name, you will hear it in the play. The League of Women Voters, National Council of Jewish Women, Colorado Attorneys for the Arts, the Colorado Bar Association, the Denver Bar Association, the Colorado Women's Bar Association Foundation, and the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Thank you to all of you. Back to you, Alan.
Thank you very much. And that last sponsor, I, as a very proud alum of the Sturm College of Law at DU, it gives me great pleasure to introduce another alum of that very prestigious law school, and someone I'm proud to call a friend and mentor, Scott Levin, the Mountain States Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League. Scott, thank you so much for being here. I turn it over to you.
Alan, thank you, and Diane so much. It is such a privilege to be here, to hear this great and exciting panel talk about these just 2 remarkable justices is almost unimaginable. I really was thrilled to be asked to be here, and I appreciate it very much. I'm also really glad to have spent the past 5 days reading that wonderful book that Alan raised up and showed you, and which I'm sure you can get very easily at the Tattered Cover. But it is my pleasure at this moment to call on Linda Hirschman, who is the author of the book upon which the play is based. And Linda, if you would, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself a bit. I know you've written so many great books and you're working on so many more, but also it'd be interesting for us if you would just set the stage about these 2 remarkable women, one the cowgirl and the other from Brooklyn. And maybe you can set that stage for us, which will help with the later discussions from their friends and clerks that we'll hear from. So Linda, go ahead. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so very much for organizing this event and for your kind attention to my book. And thank booksellers everywhere. They are the absolute best. And so, yes, I have written several books. What I write about is social change. I write about how people act collectively to change the world, hopefully for the better. And one of the many movements that I was interested in having grown up in the 20th century as a woman, was the feminist movement. But I could never find exactly what I want, a way in to tell the story about that movement until I thought about the the first and second female justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. They had, I am myself a lawyer and had argued in the Supreme Court. So, I pay attention to it. And I knew that they had a relationship of some sort. And I thought it would be wonderful to use their relationship, their ability to act together, as a way of telling the larger story of how women across America acted together to transform the legal world for women. They're not likely cooperators. I also knew that because they are so different. One from Flatbush, Brooklyn, and the other from a great ranch in the southeast corner of Arizona, which for the first 6 years of O'Connor's life had neither electricity nor running water. One Jewish and one Christian, one Democrat and one Republican, and one brunette and one blonde. I am neutral on that subject myself. So they seem at first to be very different, but as I spent the years researching and interviewing people and writing the book, I learned that they were also very similar because they never got the memo that they were not entitled to govern. They just missed school that day. And because they didn't get that memo, they took offense when people tried to stop them from accessing their full abilities and power. And when they took offense, they took action to change it. And if they couldn't act, and they were so similar in all of these ways, if they couldn't act, they waited. But almost without exception, including at Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, they eventually got to speak their minds about how it had felt to be excluded from what they thought was their due. At the end of the day, Ruth Bader Ginsburg took a lesson from her mother-in-law, Martin Ginsburg's mother, who on their wedding day gave Ginsburg a pair of earplugs. Handing her daughter-in-law her wedding gift, Mrs. Ginsburg said, "Sometimes it pays to be a little deaf." So that's our characters.
And maybe, if you would, maybe just a minute or two. You've written on so many different movements that are there. This one, obviously close to your heart, but an author has so much to pick from. How did this rise to the top?
Well, I had been both a feminist and a feminist lawyer. I met Ruth Bader Ginsburg at one of the early meetings of women in the law at Yale Law School. It had to be like 1971. And she was there with papers that would ultimately become one of the first case books on women in the law. So in many ways, it was a little bit the story of my life. The other movements are also dear to my heart. In a couple months, in February, which is Black History Month, I will publish a book about abolition, The Color of Abolition. And that will be the story of William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Maria Weston Chapman. So each one is precious to me in its own particular way.
Great. Well, thank you for bringing this story and forward, and then for it to be turned into a play. So many different ways to access the story. At this time, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce everyone to former Arizona Supreme Court Justice Ruth McGregor. She became a clerk of Sandra Day O'Connor in not necessarily the traditional way, But Justice McGregor, if you'd introduce yourself, maybe tell a little of your background and how you got into your relationship with Justice O'Connor, that would be great.
Thanks, Scott. I met Justice O'Connor in 1973 when I was a law student. Can you hear me? Okay. I was a returning law student, having had a short teaching career and then a couple of years as a housewife. And I'd gone back to law school in 1971. My husband and I were living in Phoenix. He was doing a surgical residency, and I was doing what I really wanted to do, going to law school. At that time, Justice O'Connor was Senate Majority Leader O'Connor. And after my second year, I was hired, the first year that Phoenix firms decided they really could hire women, as a summer associate at Fenimore Craig, where John O'Connor was a partner. And that's where I met Sandra O'Connor. The O'Connors were wonderful hosts. They always invited all the new lawyers and the new law clerks to their home so we could get to know everyone. So I got to know her then. And then in 1974, as I started work at Fenimore Craig as a full-time associate, then Judge O'Connor had just been elected to our trial court in Phoenix, in Maricopa County. And 5 years later became a member of the Arizona Court of Appeals. We, of course, couldn't practice in front of her because of our relationship to John, but I heard a lot from my friends about the need to be fully prepared if you went to see Judge O'Connor. And so we continued a social relationship during that time, eventually at partners meetings when I became a partner at the firm. Then she was nominated to the court, a really exciting time for all of us. And she asked me, I think with some urging from John O'Connor, with whom I worked a lot on appellate matters, whether I would come back as one of her 4 law clerks. And I did. I resigned from the firm to make sure I wouldn't run afoul of any federal laws, and went to Washington for the year. And that was my first time to work with her professionally, of course, a terrific experience. Then after that year, I returned to practice, and about 7 years later was appointed to the Court of Appeals and later the Arizona Supreme Court. And during that time, she and I worked together on a lot of different projects, starting with a project about civic education that became iCivics, and then later working with Becky Corliss's wonderful institute in Denver, Isles, as co-chairs of the O'Connor Advisory Committee, which dealt with selection and education and discipline of judges.
Excuse me, Justice. Yeah. Sorry, would you mind just lean in a little bit more? Your microphone will maybe pick it up just a little bit.
Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Is that better? I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I have a frog in my throat. I don't know why, so I'll talk louder. So we worked on projects dealing primarily with judicial selection, which had been long important to her. We went and spoke with women lawyers groups and law students, especially at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. And so during her time after retirement from the court, she and I had many adventures together and worked on these matters together until she retired from public life. So I've known her since 1974 and am pleased to be able to continue that friendship today.
That's great. And maybe, and I'll ask this of Attorney General Weiser as well, but you had this long and still do, I'm sure, relationship with her. Is there a way that you can maybe some impression of her that maybe not everybody watching tonight would know? What was your real impression of what made her such a special person or makes her today? I don't mean to be speaking in past tense. I'm sorry.
I understand. I really thought about this, and the one characteristic of Justice O'Connor that I keep coming back to that had such an impact on me is her ability to focus. No matter what she is doing, she focuses on that project. She knew either instinctively or through experience what science now tells us is true, and that's we can't multitask. We can only do things in series. So she was working on an opinion or preparing for oral argument. She was focused on that. she wasn't also working on a speech she was going to give or something else that she was writing. If any of you out there talk to her ever, you know, when she was in conversation with somebody, she would focus on that person. She wasn't looking over your shoulder to see whether somebody more important was there or because she was wanting to end the conversation. She was just focused on that conversation. So she did it with work. She did it with family and friends. She did it with activities. You know, Justice O'Connor is a very competitive person. And so she was playing tennis. She was focusing on winning. If she was playing a round of golf, she was focused on beating her own best score. And if family and friends needed something, her focus went right to that. That was always top priority for her. I think you can't really understand her without knowing how important friends and family are to her. So the thing that I think of, number one with her, is just this incredible ability to focus. I think it's what made her be so efficient, especially during that first term where there were so many demands on her time. And people say, how did she do it? I think the answer is in just taking each step. And she says she learned on the ranch, you know, whatever you were doing, you had to do it well and then move on. So that unique and unusual ability, this laser focus, is what I think of first with her.
Well, thank you so very much. And as we're trying to get to know these justices a little better, I'm going to turn to my friend, Attorney General Phil Weiser. And Phil, if you wouldn't mind, give a little bit of your background and how you got connected with Justice Ginsburg. And then I'm going to ask you that same or similar kind of question about what lasting impression she left for you.
Well, this is such an inspiring conversation. We need heroes. We need role models. We need people who inspire us. And the two women we're talking about now are in the pantheon. Both of them just truly extraordinary human beings. I got lucky. I was hired by Justice Byron White when he was retired. He had one sitting with the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, and he said to me he was happy to lend me out to an active justice. And he picked Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was White's successor. And since we're in Colorado, let me say a word about Byron White. Justice Ginsburg came to a conference about Justice White and said, of every justice on the Supreme Court, only one voted for her in every single case she argued in the court in the 1970s. Justice Byron R. White. Also, she noted that he was unusual in that when he stepped down, the statement came from both him and his wife, Mary, because they were a team. And Justice Ginsburg and Marty Ginsburg were a team. I was asked to speak at her, I think it was 20th year on the bench, and talked about what I learned from her and mentioned a few points. The most inspiring was I learned what a husband who supported his wife looked like. And that was Marty Ginsburg. His support of her was extraordinary. Another lasting impression was her commitment to excellence. She would always say, get it right and keep it tight. I have never had as demanding a boss and never will. She pushed all of us to be the best we could be. And she was truly wonderful with our families, making time, as Justice McGregor was saying, being present. And that left a lasting impression as well. So it's coming up on a year. It was September 18th. For those of us who are Jewish, we remember it as Erev Rosh Hashanah. And that was a very hard loss. And I was there with the clerks mourning and having quite the celebration of her life. And so it's still something we're adjusting to.
Well, thank you. You know, Justice McGregor talked a little bit about the political background of Justice O'Connor. You know, if I recall, she was the majority leader in Arizona, and she was really known for her analytical way of resolving problems. Maybe Attorney General Weiser, you could talk a little bit about a little bit how Justice Ginsburg, I think, her views were a little bit different. She seemed to have as an academician for a long period of time, somebody who was really seemed to be so much more contemplative in the work that she had done.
Let me say a word about Justice O'Connor that I deeply appreciate. Her work on federalism has made a lasting and important impact. And there had been work before she got to the court, case National League of Cities, that was not a viable doctrine. But O'Connor's pragmatism, her practical experience, infused her work on federalism, and a case that she wrote, United States versus New York, remains a real important one about the anti-commandeering doctrine, something I've had the chance to think about, write about, and now practice as Colorado's Attorney General. Justice Ginsburg, although from a very different background, she also had a sense of pragmatism too, and what worked. In that sense, Justice White, Justice O'Connor, and Justice Ginsburg were, although each from slightly different perspectives, very much engaged in that conversation. And I would say that each of them, White, O'Connor, and Ginsburg, practiced the judicial craft differently. Ginsburg, I think, because of the background you say, she cared a lot and thought a lot about writing and her distinct style. I don't know that I would say the same necessarily about White or O'Connor, but I would say about all of them, they all had a very strong sense about justice, about what was right, about what was important for practical governance. And so they were not as different as people sometimes might make them out to be.
Well, thank you. Ms. Hirschman, if you could maybe address, I won't call it the elephant in the room, but the obvious. So we have these two women who get to the Supreme Court, but they have very different ideologies. Their philosophies, as you said, one a Republican, one a Democrat, different kind of views, I'm sure, of government and the relationship to that. Yet it appears they could find common ground, not just on women's rights issues, but on that one perhaps the largest, but other things. Do you know, did you find out through your research and your discussions what their relationship, on a personal level, was with each other?
I figured out, and maybe Ruth would like to, Justice McGregor would like to correct me, although I did interview her for my book, thank you again, that they had what I would call a friendly alliance. They were not BFFs. When I started writing the book, I thought, oh, it's going to be so great. I'm going to find out that at lunch, they snuck out from the Supreme Court and went shopping for shoes, right? But this is not Sex and the City. They actually did not do that. When I first started asking about it, the clerk said to me, are you nuts? They would be recognized immediately. They weren't sneaking out anywhere in Washington, D.C. But they had a fruitful alliance. They helped each other. I found a letter that Sandra Day O'Connor wrote to Barry Goldwater, with whom she corresponded quite a bit, after Ruth Bader Ginsburg came to the Supreme Court. Now, this woman came from the ACLU. She was very different politically from both Sandra Day O'Connor and Barry Goldwater. But O'Connor writes to Goldwater in an unrelated letter. And she goes out of her way to say, Justice Ginsburg is going to be a wonderful and excellent justice. And you know that she knew exactly, Sandra Day O'Connor always knew exactly what she was doing, what the politics of saying that to Goldwater was. And when she was nominated, she was nervous, and people asked her why. And she said she was nervous because it was okay to be first, but she didn't want to be last. And I think when someone as stunningly competent and well-credentialed as Ruth Bader Ginsburg came next, Justice O'Connor was happy because she knew she wouldn't be last, and that indeed the next person along was going to push the project of having women as full participants in the very best possible way. I also learned, which I did not know, it really came as a surprise to me, that when Justice Ginsburg came to the court in 1993, nobody mattered more to her than Justice O'Connor. And that's very interesting because there were other justices on the court whose politics and whose background was much closer to Ginsburg's than O'Connor's was. And indeed, the Chief Justice matters a lot for a variety of reasons, but nobody mattered more to her than Justice O'Connor.
That's great. That's really wonderful. And Justice McGregor, let me ask you then, I don't know if you had a sense from either your time when you were clerking on the court, which I think, were you there during that, or it was right before Justice Ginsburg came on bench?
But I was there during her first term. So Justice Ginsburg had just been the year before appointed to the Court of Appeals. So I wasn't there when she came to the Supreme Court, but I did talk to Justice O'Connor about it.
Yeah. So I mean, again, just with these different ideologies and political backgrounds and different approaches towards everything, what was your sense of how Justice O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg viewed each other?
Well, I know Justice O'Connor was really happy when Justice Ginsburg was appointed. And she'd been the only woman on the Supreme Court for so long, it must have seemed like centuries to her. And you know, anybody who's been the first woman, the first Black, the first Hispanic, the first openly gay or transgender person knows it's really lonely in a lot of ways. But as soon as you add another person, it isn't just two. It's like suddenly you're a member of a group that understands you and that you can rely upon. And I think it was very much that way for Justice O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg. I know we've talked about the ways they were different, but as far as their relationship, I think there were so many ways they were similar. They came from different parts of the country, but they all experienced the same discrimination. They both experienced the same discrimination looking for a job. They knew what it was like to have a profession and raise children. They knew what it was like to have a husband who was also a professional, but who was supportive of them. And these were things that mattered to them. So I think we do, and the play emphasizes more than Linda's book did, I think, the physical differences between them. You know, the tall, athletic daughter of the West versus the diminutive, scholarly daughter of Brooklyn. I don't think some of those things mattered very much to them. And I think it might have been back, I think, to what Phil was saying. There was this common core that their belief in constitutional principles and in the importance of upholding those principles and the importance of reaching a just, often practical result as they went through their analysis. So they were quite similar in the way that they approached cases. They didn't always come to the same conclusion, but at core, I think they had very much the same beliefs. And it was a good professional and I think personal relationship. They surely respected one another.
That's great. And Attorney General Weiser, when you were at the court, they were both there at that time, correct?
Were.
And so did you witness any of this relationship that they had with each other, or at least respect?
Well, a signature moment involved Justice Ginsburg authoring the opinion in the Virginia Military Institute case, where she invoked Justice O'Connor's language from an earlier case involving I believe, nursing school in Mississippi, where O'Connor had written, you need an exceedingly persuasive justification to exclude one gender from a professional opportunity. And Ginsburg seized that language. So you kind of saw the two of them collaborating on that area of doctrine. And in that sense, that opinion was something they shared, even though Ginsburg wrote it, but she very much paid homage to Justice O'Connor's earlier opinion.
And Ms. Hirschman, I think I recall from your book that actually the honor would have gone to Justice O'Connor to actually deliver the opinion, but she did it otherwise. Could you maybe tell that story?
It's the opening scene in my book. And I think it tells more about their relationship than anything that else I learned. The United States versus Virginia was a case about whether a public university could be all male, could exclude women from its ranks. And it was, in a sense, an early battle in the culture wars, because VMI was very much of a militarized, macho environment, and they defended their men-only policy on that basis. So it was way more meaningful than the particular facts of the case presented. And the justices get together in conference after there's an argument, and they vote on how they're going to decide the case. And it emerged that the court was going to decide the case in favor of the United States. The case was called, iconically, United States versus Virginia. And that meant, if they were going to vote in favor of the United States, that they were going to force the Virginia Military Institute to admit women to its ranks. And when the justices vote, if the Chief Justice is in the majority, he picks who's going to write the opinion. And if the Chief Justice is not in the majority, then the senior most justice in the majority gets to pick who writes the opinion. And I could never get them to admit whether it was the Chief Justice who decided it or whether it was Justice Stevens, who would have been the senior justice if Rehnquist hadn't been in the majority, because Rehnquist was sometimes in the majority and sometimes he changed his mind. Anyway, somebody decided that this incredibly important case about the cultural role of women in America should go to the first woman justice on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, right? And either Rehnquist or Stevens told O'Connor that she had the assignment to write the opinion. And she said, this should be Ruth's. Because Justice Ginsburg, in the years that she was working at the ACLU from 1970 to 1980, had really made the body of law that transformed the 14th Amendment into a vehicle for the equality of men and women, as well as for racial equality. She had really crafted that. It was, in my opinion, the highlight of her career. So O'Connor knew who deserved to do it, and in a very rare act for Supreme Court justices, gave this really important landmark opinion to Ginsburg.
That's great. You know, I discussed with Justice McGregor this political background a little bit of Justice O'Connor. Maybe to the people that are watching this, they may not know it. While Ruth Bader Ginsburg, before she went onto the bench, she was a professor, and she was also held this special role at the ACLU. Perhaps you could share that.
Are you asking me?
Yes, please. Sorry, I'm looking at a picture, not knowing that you can't tell. You're the only person I'm looking at. Yes. Thank you.
So the then head of the ACLU National in New York, R.A. Nair, had decided that women's rights were the racial civil rights movement of the 70s, and he wanted a piece of the action for the ACLU. So he founded the ACLU Women's Rights Project charged with the task of eliminating discrimination against women in the law in the United States starting in 1970. And he cast about for someone to head the project. And he had a writing test. And maybe Attorney General Weiser can talk to us a little bit about this. As soon as he saw, I interviewed Nair, as soon as he saw Ruth Bader Ginsburg's writing sample, the job was filled. He made her the head of the ACLU Women's Rights Project. And in the next 10 years, she transformed the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution into a vehicle for gender equality, an act of constitutional justice and fairness that I hope we'll get a chance to see sometime in my life.
Thanks. Attorney General Weiser, and knowing the Constitution and its amendments, as I know you do, you know, the 14th Amendment was not really viewed as something that was going to be providing entry point for gender, for women in particular at the time. Was there some discussion about this that you had learned at the time about how she really did sort of change that, as Ms. Hirschman said, that entire body of law to be able to look at the 14th Amendment in such a different way?
Well, this is a good time to bring in another giant who served with Justice O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg, which is Justice Scalia. And when you put their views together, O'Connor's lived experience, which part of the challenge is when you think about Justice O'Connor, I don't know there's a full appreciation for that lived experience. And that's part of the bond that she and Justice Ginsburg had. They both had trouble getting jobs when they graduated at the top of their classes in law school. I think both Linda and Justice McGregor could probably talk even more to that than I can. And that gave them a sense about what it meant to fight for equality, having to earn it themselves, and being subject to discriminatory treatment. Justice Scalia was loath to join the opinion of VMI. He was the sole dissenter. Thomas was recused. And what was animating Scalia was a sense that change should not come through constitutional requirements, but should come through societal change. And Justice Ginsburg's response was, if you look at the original Constitution, which was what Scalia would do, women weren't allowed to serve on juries. And the fact that those who adopted the 14th Amendment, as you note, didn't think about gender equality, that was of no moment to Justice Ginsburg or Justice O'Connor. Both of them said, we should view the commitment to equal protection of the laws at a higher level of generality, which is what they might have aspired for themselves if they could know what we know, not limit equality to what existed in 1866 when the amendment was adopted.
So there's a wonderful, the Supreme Court records the arguments. So when I was working on my book, I listened to her argue. She argued many times in front of the Supreme Court in the 1970s, and I listened to the recordings. And one of the recordings I listened to was her first oral argument on this subject in the Supreme Court of the United States. And you can see her doing exactly that for the justices. She says, it looks different. Race is not gender. But what is it about discrimination based on race that makes it wrong? And she lifted them up to a level of abstractness where they could see that the two things were similar. And therefore, they were comfortable in extending the living Constitution to a new subject because it resembled the original subject. It was a brilliant piece of argument. She was a real intellectual, and it people think of like airy professors and that we don't have any relevance to the real world and stuff, but that's actually wrong. She used her incredibly powerful mind to figure out where the argument was and make exactly the argument that could persuade the 9 old men who she was arguing to in the 1970s.
Well, Justice McGregor, when we're talking about these lived experiences, again, you have this very focused period of time that Justice Ginsburg is working on women's legal rights issues. And in some ways, and I don't know, and maybe you can enlighten us, with Justice O'Connor, she was living it, if not maybe being the academic and studious and looking for the case and doing the things that Justice Ginsburg did. But were women's rights a motivating issue to her in the same way, do you believe?
Not in the same way as for Justice Ginsburg. I think few could be in the same category as Justice Ginsburg. She was in a very different position as a Republican legislator in what was then a very conservative state. And if you I don't intend to be an expert on her legislative background, but I do know that if you look to what she did while she was in the legislature, you can see the same careful step-by-step approach as some people like and some people criticize in her judicial opinions. So that while she was in the legislature, one of the things she spearheaded was removing all the gender-specific language from our statutes in Arizona. This was a pretty big deal. It controlled a lot of things. She was, I believe, chairing the Judiciary Committee of the Senate when there were hearings on the Equal Rights Amendment, something that never gained a lot of traction in Arizona. But she did bring it to the fore. So I think you see that same for her as a legislator, what is possible. She was concerned about women not being part of the judiciary, and we had elections then in Arizona. She tried to get a referendum on the ballot. She couldn't get that through the Senate. So working with business leaders and the newspapers and so forth, they got it placed on they got it placed as an initiative on the ballot in Arizona. And so it was a merit selection was adopted in Arizona by popular vote. So it was that same kind of careful working. Justice Ginsburg did this careful step-by-step in deciding what cases to take within the courts. So I think you can see them both working. Justice O'Connor would never cop to being a feminist, but she clearly was. She just didn't like the term.
You know, maybe you could share, Justice McGregor, you could share with us, by the time because I don't know the experience of everybody that's watching this or what their age might be, but by the time I got to law school in the early 1980s, I graduated in I started in 79 and graduated in 82. 51% of my class was female. But I know that 5 years before, and certainly 10, 15, 20 years before, it was a very different story. You said, if I heard you right, you graduated in 71?
74.
74. So that decade difference, maybe you can explain to people what life was like.
Yeah. I mean, the decade of the 70s for women in the law was where we really got our foot in the door. When I started law school in 1971, we had 12% women, and that was regarded as a huge number of women to be in a law school class. By the time we got to the 80s, as you point out, about half the women, some schools 40%, some 50, some 39, were women. And after Justice O'Connor was appointed to the Supreme Court, things really changed for women on the bench. When she was appointed to the Supreme Court, I think only like 8 states had ever had a woman on their state Supreme Court. And by 10 or 15 years later, almost all the states had had. The percentage of women in both the federal and the state bench had increased from 3% or 2% to 15%, 20% some places. So the decade of the 70s, and then I think not just the impact of Justice O'Connor being appointed, but that clearly played a role in it. It opened people's eyes as to what could be done, I think. So yeah, it was a very different time than when Justice O'Connor graduated in the 1950s. You know, not only was she competing with all the men who had come back from World War II and gone to school and then to professional school, but there just were not many jobs for women. Something, again, as we mentioned, she and Justice Ginsburg had in common.
That's great. Well,
can I jump in on that, Scott?
As a matter of fact, I was going to call on the former dean of the University of Colorado Law School to talk about his lived experience and how that changed by the time you were involved in legal education.
A few thoughts on this. One, when Justice Ginsburg came and joined us for a fireside chat, I asked her the question, and I believe this question may have been, I can't remember if I asked it or I asked it on behalf of an audience member. When will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? Her famous answer was, when there are 9. There were 9 men. There should be, or could be, 9 women. The other point, Justice Ginsburg had an experience that Justice O'Connor had. I don't know if O'Connor talked about this, but Ginsburg did. The difference being the only woman on the court or being one of 2 or more. And what she said is it was materially different when you were the only woman. And that gets to a point about diversity and inclusion. that we can and should reflect on, which is when we don't have critical mass, and this is a concept that Justice O'Connor embraces in the opinion involving Grutter, affirmative action case in the University of Michigan, the ability for people from diverse backgrounds to be heard is different. And one of the painful realities is when I graduated law school, and it was 50-50 when I graduated in 1994, 14% of law firm partners were women. Jessica Brown will be able to jump in with the exact statistic today. It's approaching 20%. That's a generation, and we've only made a 6% jump for law firm partners. Now, half the deputy attorney generals in my office are women. There are lots of contexts in the Colorado legislature. We've got more women than men. And law firm partnerships have proven to be remarkably and painfully stubborn. And there's a lot we as a profession have to account for and work on to address that.
You're here. Ms. Hirschman, maybe you can, this would be a great time to share that Gibson Dunn story, with no offense to our friends that are watching here.
No, of course not. So when Justice O'Connor was graduating from Stanford, maybe second or third in her class, it's always been debated whether Rehnquist was ahead of her or not. He got a job clerking for a United States Supreme Court justice, and she tried to get a job with a law firm. And she called all the law firms that had posted on the bulletin board in Stanford Law School looking for first-year associates, and all of them told her that they weren't hiring women. And finally, she did a classic O'Connor thing, which is she rattled her network of acquaintances and got one of her girlfriends to get her father, who was a partner at Gibson Dunn, to give her an interview. And she went and interviewed with the girlfriend's father. And he told her that they were not going to hire women to be lawyers at Gibson Dunn. But if she wanted to, she could come to work for the firm as a legal secretary. And she said no. And the story of how she finagled her way into a job in the public sector is also wonderful. But moving right along, she then gets to be the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. So it was a really good thing for her that Gibson Dunn didn't want to hire her. Otherwise, she'd just be a partner at Gibson Dunn. And on their centenary, they invited her to come and give the keynote address to the celebration of their anniversary. And she went, and she reminded them of how they had thought she was only fit to be a law secretary when she graduated first or second in a class at Stanford. And she later told David Letterman, I think it was, that it was the most fun speech she had ever given.
That's
right. They waited. I mean, they waited. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked when she was a first-year law student at Harvard, one of a handful at Harvard. The dean at Harvard, Dean Weiser, I'm so happy that you never did anything like this, invited the 9 women or whatever it was in her Harvard class to dinner. And as part of the ritual, he asked each of them to explain how she justified taking the place of a man at Harvard for her initiation into the community of lawyers at Harvard Law School. That's what she got to do. And she gave a terrible, obsequious answer about having to understand her husband's work, which was manifestly nonsense even then. And later, after the feminist movement erupted, Ruth Bader Ginsburg told that story so many times that the dean of the Harvard Law School, Erwin Griswold, wrote a letter to the student newspaper saying that he had only been joking. Only joking.
Well, as we know, a lot of people like to rewrite history, right? to doing it. And I think, you know, whether it's as Attorney General Weiser pointed out, the lack of partners. I mean, it's even the lack of, I'm sure, job opportunities out of law school are very different right now. And to think that we are 50 years out and still having this is just remarkable. But
hardest social change. I write about social change. I've written about race. I've written about sexual orientation. I've written about sexual harassment. I mean, this is my wheelhouse, and it is so stubborn.
Yeah.
It's so stubborn.
So we've talked a little bit about a couple of these cases where the justices did agree, especially around these women's rights, but I don't know if Justice McGregor, if you experienced, what happened when we had a question from somebody that's watching, what happened when the justices didn't agree with each other? Do you know what that kind of relationship was like?
Well, I think Bill could probably answer this better, but I can't imagine it was anything other than cordial. During the time I was on the court, I never saw any personal attacks between the judges. Sometimes in writing, they would get a little raw with one another, but as far as personal relationships or anger being expressed, I never saw that while I was clerking, but Justice Ginsburg wasn't yet there, so I'm just guessing.
How about you, Attorney General Weiser?
So I have a couple of thoughts on this. First, when I was at NYU Law School, Justice Ginsburg gave a speech. It was the Madison Lecture. It was called Speaking in a Judicial Voice. And one half of the speech was about how justices or judges talk to one another. And she quoted some vituperative rhetoric. And Justice Scalia had used some of that rhetoric against Justice O'Connor.
Right.
I think there actually was a much more strained relationship between O'Connor and Scalia. I think O'Connor may have disappointed Scalia in some ways that led him to relate to her in ways that could not have been easy for Justice O'Connor. But both Justice O'Connor and Justice Kennedy found their own path that basically deprived Scalia from the majority in a number of cases. The year I was clerking, this was a meaningful case from Colorado, the case Romer versus Evans was decided, another equality case around sexual orientation. Both Justice O'Connor and Justice Kennedy joined with Justice Ginsburg, leaving Scalia furious in dissent. And so, partly because of her believing that norm, and partly because I think her respect for O'Connor was deep, I don't think there was ever a harsh word that I saw. And even when they disagreed, there was respect that continued. And I think that part of the beauty of the Supreme Court is to allow disagreement and to have it respectful. That case I mentioned, United States versus New York, Justice White dissented in that case. It was not yet Justice Ginsburg. And Justice White made a pretty important point, which is the legislation that was held invalid in that case as commandeering was legislation that the states had lobbied for. And so Justice White made a very politically astute, pragmatic objection. And Justice O'Connor took a principled line about anti-commandeering and protecting state sovereignty. There's truth in both those positions. And we as lawyers, those engaged in jurisprudence, are wise to engage in that enterprise with respect, with listening. And I think both Justice O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg did that extraordinarily well.
I can't let the moment go without digressing just a moment, because you mentioned it. These interpersonal relationships that the justices have with each other, the one that, of course, most people find most surprising is the one between Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg. And what I'm almost hearing you say is they had somewhat of a respect for one another because they did respect they came from different positions. Is that your take?
Well, this is Constitution Week. Constitution Day is on Friday. I'm going to put for everyone to see a blog post that I worked on. I'm the head of a group called the Attorney General's Alliance, and my initiative this year is the Ginsburg-Scalia Initiative to celebrate respectful and engaged dialogue that Ginsburg and Scalia modeled. And that what Ginsburg would say is listening to those dissents, including the one in the VMI case, sharpened her thinking and made her opinions better. And we should not be afraid of that engagement, that dialogue. We should welcome it. And part of the problem in the world we're living in today is if you look at Twitter, not you, Scott, you're wonderful on Twitter, but there are people who demonize others with ad hominem attacks and contribute to polarization, spread misinformation. We need more of what we've seen from relationships like O'Connor and Ginsburg and Scalia and Ginsburg.
That's great. Justice McGregor, I just want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about that as well.
Well, Justice O'Connor certainly did not have the relationship with Justice Scalia that Justice Ginsburg did. And I have to say, I'm interested to see your initiative because as a friend of Justice O'Connor, and also as someone who believes that judges should be careful in how they write, whether in dissent or in the majority, I was really appalled by some of Justice Scalia's language. Justice O'Connor never said that it bothered her. I don't know how any human would not be bothered by what were ad hominem attacks, I thought. But I don't think that, I think they all tried very hard to not have it impact a personal relationship and to have at least the veneer of civility in their personal dealings with one another. I just have a very clear view in my own mind about how appellate judges should handle writing when they are in dissent. And I think that a personal attack or an attempt to degrade the views of another judge just has no place in our judicial discourse.
I want to register my agreement with Justice McGregor on this subject. I have never been as enamored of the relationship between Justices Ginsburg and Scalia as other people are. And part of that, I think, may be because I had to read so many of the opinions for the book. And I would posit in Constitution Week that it's possible that some of the red hot rhetoric that we're now seeing in many places can be traced back to Justice Scalia or his law clerks who are now in positions of power. So I never bought into that. One of their colleagues, they were friends on the DC Circuit as well. They sat together on the DC Circuit before they both went to the Supreme Court. And one of their colleagues on the DC Circuit told me in an interview that he thought that Scalia ran a lot of social offensive line for Ginsburg, who was notoriously, shall we say, quiet and not the most liveliest person at the party, and that Marty played that role for her in the social life. But when they were on trips, court trips and stuff like that, Scalia was her social wingman.
Isn't that amazing?
There's a tidbit for you.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I'm going to come back and ask you about some other tidbits in just 1 second, but I did want to point out one of our great guests pointed out that the Justices O'Connor and Scalia appeared on the PBS series Ethics in America, and it was always an interesting tension-building kind of episodes, but Justice O'Connor always got the last word in. So thank you for that, Cynthia. I'm going to ask this of you, Ms. Hirschman, because I would never ask clerks and friends to report on personal tidbits, but maybe is there something that you learned in doing your research about the justices, their personal lives, or something about them that you think that the people would find surprising?
I don't know if people would find it surprising. I will say this, Martin Ginsburg is in heaven now. But if he ever comes back, he's mine. He was the most amazing husband, companion, fun-loving. I mean, there are so many stories about Martin Ginsburg appearing in people's offices when Bill Clinton was considering filling the vacancy on the Supreme Court of the United States in 1993. People in Washington who I interviewed would say, and so I looked up and Marty Ginsburg was standing in my office. He arranged for Ruth Bader Ginsburg and he rattled the cage of Bernard Nussbaum, who was the White House counsel at the time, and got Nussbaum to set up a dinner for himself and his candidate for the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I believe it was Orrin Hatch, who they really needed to win over. He set, it was Marty who set up that dinner at the Inn at Little Washington. He was an astonishingly wonderful partner and cheerleader for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's a beautiful.
And on the other hand, also, I'm so moved by Justice O'Connor's also decision when she did to step down from the court, and her relationship with her husband. Did you get insights into that as well?
One of the Justice McGregor, I'm sure, knows a lot more about this than I do. It's hearsay, but one of the clerks told me that when John O'Connor was beginning to show signs of the dementia that eventually caused her to retire and accompany him back to Phoenix, she used to take him to her chambers and keep him in her chambers. Can you imagine having to do the work of a justice, Supreme Court justice, with all that work? And also look after your disabled husband in your very chambers? I thought that was very touching.
Justice McGregor, again, I don't mean to make you share something about a friend that you're not comfortable doing, but maybe you could give a little light, shed a little light onto that.
I think what she said was exactly what the situation was. She had tried everything she could to find a way to continue her work on the court and care for John O'Connor. And eventually it became clear that both things couldn't be done. So this again is, when I say you have to understand her devotion to family and friends, devotion to her husband would always take priority over a position that she loved doing. And so I think no one was surprised. It was just so sad that he deteriorated so very quickly after she retired from the court. But I think for her, there was really no choice. She had tried what she could, but he needed to have her around him. He was calmer and more comfortable when she was there. And so the only way she could give him the attention she believed he needed was to retire from the court.
Wow.
And typical, I think a very typical decision for her.
That might not have been surprising to those of you on the inside and that knew her, but from the outside, just such an amazing, and the love, the integrity, all of those things that are there. So I think as we're getting towards the end of our time together, I want to offer, if I could, to Attorney General Phil Weiser, maybe 2-3 minutes, just your kind of wrap up thoughts that you have, and then I'll run around the horn to everybody.
Well, let me go back to where I started. The profiles of these two remarkable historical figures, they belong to the ages now, give us inspiration on what pioneers for justice looks like. There's a great saying, I think it comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, do not follow the trail, go where there is no trail and blaze a path. The trail was not open to these remarkable women. They were shut down by establishment law firms, and instead found alternative pathways to make a lasting impact on the law, on the people whose lives they touched, and on the United States of America. And for all of us thinking about how we serve, that's an incredibly powerful example. And as someone whose life was touched by particularly Justice Ginsburg, but I have great respect for Justice O'Connor, they are examples of the law as an instrument for justice and for perfecting our union. And I'm very grateful for both of them.
Thank you, and we're grateful to you. Justice McGregor, some concluding thoughts?
Yeah, Justice O'Connor was occasionally asked the tombstone question, And she always said she would be pleased if her epitaph said, "Here lies a good judge." And I think everybody would agree that that's a fair thing for her to be remembered for. She'll always be the first woman to serve in the United States Supreme Court. But I think the other thing that's just as important is that she came to the court at a time when women in positions of authority and power were at least very suspect. And people didn't have a lot of faith that women could do those jobs. So she did it, but at the same time as doing her job, she also showed everyone that you could combine a personal life and a professional life. You could still give attention to, as a wife and a mother and a grandmother and a friend and a role model and a mentor. And the fact that she and then later Justice Ginsburg were able to do all of those things, I think just had an impact on so many women, some men, but especially women. And it's an impact that will far survive either of those two wonderful women who really did change the scope of law for women. What a wonderful first two female justices on the court. But I think both of them would be just dismayed that 40 years after Justice O'Connor's nomination, we still have never had more than 3 women at a time on the court. It really is quite shocking. And I think Justice O'Connor would agree.
Hear ye, hear ye. Thank you. That's right. And Ms. Hirschman, you know, it's not just that you wrote this wonderful book and that it's become a play, but now you have, you know, Supreme Court justices from states like Arizona and attorney generals from Colorado and other people, that you're giving such a wonderful excuse for people to talk about these two terrific justices. I guess, what are your thoughts? I mean, you've yourself created a lasting legacy for this.
Thank you. When I was a little girl, there was a little library near my grade school. And after I went to school every day, I would go to the library. And there was a shelf in the library of biographies of women, lives of women, Anne Carroll of Carrollton, Clara Barton, the Julia Ward Howe, the woman who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. They were all, I mean, they were the ones, right? Lucy Stone, the suffragist. And I read them avidly when I was little. I read them avidly. And one of the things I learned when I was doing my research for this book was that so did Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She went to the neighborhood library every Saturday with her mother, and her mother would have her hair done, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg would go to the library, and she read the stories of, and she's not that much older than I am, she read the stories of the heroic women. So I bless you for saying that. It would be on my tombstone, I would love it to say that I added some books about great women for the next generation of girls to find in the library and be inspired by.
Well, thanks. And on behalf of the little boys out there in the audience, we're glad to be inspired by the women in our lives as well. So thank you for that. Listen, this has just been remarkable for me. I started by saying what a privilege it was, and now I have a number of new friends that I've created out of it, and certainly much respect for all of you. For the past nearly 11 years after I stopped actively practicing law and came to the Anti-Defamation League, I've been motivated by our mission, which includes to secure justice and fair treatment to all. And I know that that's what both Justice O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg stood for as well. So thank you to all of our panelists. And I'd like to now turn it back over to my friend, Alan Frosch.
Thank you so much for agreeing to moderate. What an amazing job. To our panel, thank you so much for your thoughtful, candid responses about these titans in our legal field and the history of this country. Thank you all so much for making this presentation so incredible. On that note, we have another incredible presentation scheduled for September 28th, moderated by Professor Helen Norton from the University of Colorado School of Law. We have the 3 sitting female Supreme Court justices from our state of Colorado and their impressions of some of the cases that made it into the book, made into the play and that were so important in the legal careers of these two justices about which this book was written. Again, please visit www.tatteredcover.com/sisters-law for more information about the remaining 3 webinar series coming up. We will be sending out the YouTube links for recordings of both this session and our session from August 25th about the act of the play and the art of the play, excuse me. I'm hearing my own handwriting. So we'll get those recordings to you all as well. If you all are interested in more about specifically Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, there's a presentation at 8 p.m. on PBS, This American Experience, which I believe Ms. Hirschman will be. You say you will be live tweeting that?
Well, I was in. They interviewed me for it.
Excellent. Well,
if you haven't had enough, you can now watch.
Of course. If you want more context on her life, that'll be a great presentation in about 20 minutes here in Denver, certainly. And again, for more information about this series, please visit the website. More information about the ticket link for the Sisters-in-Law play starting in a couple weeks here in Denver. And again, we are pleased to have you all here tonight. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you soon. To those celebrating, Happy New Year, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.